Okay, so I'm gonna help you guys go down some history here in California when it comes to slavery, the lesser known history of slavery in California. So let's just go ahead and jump right into this and let's read off, everything that is here. So it says Los Angeles, despite its ratification in 1850 as a free state prohibiting slavery and indentured servitude, California wavered on the status of enslaved people throughout its early history, creating legal structures that allowed slave owning whites migrating from the Midwest and South to retain ownership over enslaved black people. California bound slavery on the New Frontier, 1848 through 1865. Curated by Tyree Boyd Pates and Taylor Bathwood Porter, brings together historical artifacts and stories of self liberation at the California African American Museum to uncover the lesser known history of slavery in the Golden State, spanning from 16th century Spanish colonization to the post Civil War Reconstruction era. California Bound recounts the tumultuous history of mass migration, displacement, and litigation that led to the establishment of California's earliest African American communities. And as you can see here, a little painting here, or drawing. So, while the exhibition focuses on the hundreds of African enslaved Africans who were brought to California shortly before and after its ratification as a free state in 1850, the curators date the earliest presence of people of African descent in the region to the 1700s and 1800s. Spanish colonization of the Gulf of California relied on the labor of enslaved indigenous and African people since the 16th century, resulted in a multicultural landscape. An early community of non indigenous people in California were the Californios, who were either mestizos, mixed European and indigenous ancestry, or of mixed African and indigenous ancestry. Among Los Angeles' first settlers, the pobladors, sorry, who arrived from Mexico in 1781, more than half of 11 families were of African or part African ancestry. While the end of the Mexican American War in 1848 promised full citizenship and property rights to Californios who were previously Mexican citizens, the discovery of gold in the same year would upturn their lives and the lives of the roughly 150,000 indigenous people who were living in the region. Between 1848 and 1854, up to 300,000 people entered the region as part of the gold rush, resulting in Californios and indigenous people being outnumbered and claims to their land undermined. The mass migration of people, including included Mexicans, Chileans, Peruvians, and Chinese, along with freed Africans who also sought opportunity in the West. Many of these minority groups, however, were exploited as agricultural laborers, domestic servants, and sex workers, while white migrants from the American South brought enslaved Africans to work in the gold mines. California Bound goes into great detail about the political and economic divides that emerged from debates over California's statehood and the legal status of slavery. It explains the divide between pro enslavement Southerners who sought to maintain the institution of slavery and the anti enslavement Northerners who desired to abolish it outright. A third political group in California, the Free Soil Party, also opposed slavery not on moral grounds but based on the economic self interest of whites who lacked the capital to compete with slave owners and wished to eliminate competition from African laborers, both free and enslaved. So California joined the U.S. as part of the Compromise of 1850, which also included the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act as federal law. The new law required enslaved fugitives to be returned to their enslavers upon capture, and officials and citizens of free states to cooperate accordingly. While California's entry into the Union as a free state might have been considered a victory for abolitionists and enslaved Africans, political realities within the state tempered any hope that California could become a true safe haven. Shortly after statehood, pro enslavement lawmakers passed statutes excluding minority testimonies against whites in criminal and civil cases. In 1852, the state legislature passed the California Fugitive State Slave Law, legalizing the arrest and removal of runaway enslaved Africans who arrived with their enslavers before statehood. These legal structures would set the stage for 8 stories that are the heart of California Bound. While the exhibition's legal documents and letters don't always make for the most compelling visual artifacts, the creators bring their content to life by surfacing 8 legal cases that resulted in freedom or enslavement of Africans living in California. There's a story of Frank, an enslaved 18-year-old forcibly brought to work in the Sierra Nevada mines, who later escaped to San Francisco and legally obtained freedom with support from the local community of free Africans who petitioned on his behalf. The legal precedent in the case would shock the state's pro enslavement legislators and result in the passage of the state's own fugitive slave law in 1852. And there's another, picture. So, the story of Bridget Biddy Mason might one day be adapted into a film for a spectacular way in which Mason and her family were rescued by black cowboys at the Cayon Pass in San Bernardino. Biddy Mason, who was born into slavery in 1818, arrived in California with her family as slaves of Robert Marion Smith and Mormon, who migrated west to establish a religious compound in the state. In Los Angeles County, Mason befriended a free African couple, Robert and Minnie Owens, who were successful owners of a livery stable and cattle business. When Smith attempted to move to Texas, a pro slavery state, with Mason and her family, the Owens alerted the county sheriff and gathered a posse of cowboys from their ranch to prevent Smith from leaving California. The the ensuing court battle resulted in the Mason family acquiring their freedom, and the eventual marriage between Biddy's daughter Hannah and the Owens' son Charles. Biddy Mason would go on to become a prominent businesswoman herself, amassing a sizable fortune and later financing and founding the first African Methodist Episcopal Church in 1872, Los Angeles' oldest African American church. As can be expected, not all stories have happy endings, as is the case in the Perkins story. In 1849, three enslaved men, Carter Perkins, Robert Perkins, and Sandy Jones, migrated from Mississippi to California with their enslaver's son, Charles Perkins, who hoped to make a fortune during the gold rush. Having depleted all his resources and fallen short in his plans, the Felson returned home to Mississippi in 1851, leaving behind his family's slaves. The three men were later granted freedom by a friend of Perkins and went into the mining business for themselves, finding success where Charles Perkins did not. After the passage of the California Fugitive Slave Act, Charles Perkins re-enslaved the men by forming a posse who stormed their cabin at night and put them in front of a Sacramento judicial officer who would ultimately send them back to Mississippi. California Bound also surfaced the ignominious history of Los Angeles' early political leaders in the story of Emily and Maria, two enslaved miners who were brought to California from Missouri by the family of Benjamin Davis Wilson, Los Angeles' second mayor from 1851 through 1862, and seeking out domestic servants at low cost. Wilson invoked California's Act for the Government and Protection of Indians of 1850, which promoted the removal of indigenous and enslaved African children from their families and imposed upon them indentured servitude. Acquiring legal guardianship of Emily and Maria through this law, Wilson and his family held the two women as enslaved servants within their homes until they were 21. According to the exhibition, California's position on slavery would become less ambiguous as the Civil War took shape. Pro enslavement Southern Democrats would leave California in support of the Confederacy, leaving the anti enslavement Republican Party largely in control of the state's legislature. During the Civil War, California would align itself with the North, providing a union with logistical support and gold from its Sierra Nevada mines. While the question of slavery would be settled with the end of the Civil War, California would continue to waver on its status of its minority population, particularly black residents who acquire freedom through the 13th Amendment. And as you can see here, another picture. This was the emancipation of the Negroes back in January 1863, the past and future, which at that time Abraham Lincoln, signed an executive order. So, continue. Just as the Free Soil Party opposed slavery, not out of concern for black people as human beings. Key word, all right? Not out of concern for black people as human beings. The state of California, shortly after the abolition of slavery across the country, quickly passed laws limiting voting, property, and marriage rights for black people and other minorities. Having revealed its true intent, the state will go on to establish itself as no less racist or more progressive than its southern counterparts, leaving these truths as a bookend. The creators ask us to consider how this origin story of California might inform our understanding of the country's political system today. All right, so now we're going to dive even more into history of California. Now this time it's coming out of the California Sun, written by Mike McFate. So, California's Black Slaves and the Myth of Free Soil. So let's go ahead and read this piece. So it says in 1852, 3 black men that we just read about on the other article here, Carter Perkins, Robert Perkins, and Sandy Jones, were asleep in a cabin where a group of armed whites broke in, loaded the men into a wagon, and hauled them before a justice of the peace. The captives were declared fugitive slaves and ordered back to their former masters. This story comes not from slave-holding America, but from the officially free soil of California. Contrary to popular myths that the American West as exempt from the struggles over slavery, the practice was widespread and rarely challenged. And as you can see, the 3 men getting dragged out of their log cabin. There's a picture. That history is now the subject of an exhibit at the California African American Museum in Los Angeles, and once again, California bound, Slavery on the New Frontier, 1848 through 1865. By the letter of the law, yes, California was a free state, says Stacy L. Smith, the author of Freedom's Frontier, California and the Struggle Over Unfree Labor, Emancipation, and Reconstruction. But a thorny question emerged after the state banned slavery in 1849. She added, did it mean that everybody who was enslaved and who was already there was automatically freed? The California Supreme Court eventually said no. And as you can see here, there are men on the railroad handcarts in California, Sierra Nevada. All right. During the gold rush, which kicked off this week in 1848, more than a third of California's American-born residents hailed from the pro-slavery South. Hundreds of these transplants brought slaves who became part of a patchwork of unfreed labor systems common in California at the time, among them Native American servants, Chilean serfs, bound women, and indentured children. California's pro-slavery Democrats, vote blue no matter who, people, pay attention to this one. California's pro-slavery Democrats passed a fugitive slave law in 1852 that vitiated the state's constitutional prohibition against enslavement. It allowed whites to keep slaves they had already brought into California as long as they eventually transported them back to the South. The state thus treated escaped slaves as fugitives to be forcibly returned into bondage. All right, another picture with white and African American miners in the El Dorado County. Antebellum slavery persisted on California soil, both formally and informally, into the 1860s before finally crumbling in the face of legal activism by free African Americans and the growing power of anti-slavery Republicans. Still, racism remained virulent. During the post-Civil War era, the same politicians who had challenged slavery embraced the anti-Chinese movement and passed some of the country's most racially discriminatory laws. Here's a picture of William M. Gwynn, a Mississippi slaveholder turned Democratic senator from California, was a proponent of slavery as a viable economic institution in the West. Yep, pay attention to that one. Vote blue no matter who, people. The civil rights of non-whites were so contentious that California failed to ratify the 14th and 15th Amendment, granting citizenship to former slaves and ensuring the rights to black men to vote until the middle of the 20th century. The California Bound exhibit runs until April 28 and uses historical photos, documents, and ephemera to chronicle the human catastrophe of slavery in the Golden State. Tyree Boyd Pates, a co-creator, said he hoped the materials would help people grapple with the reverberations of the state's racist legacy. And this is what white people feared, the white supremacists to be exact. And it says here, The White Slave, a stereo card printed in San Francisco in 1863, reflecting the fears among some whites about allowing free blacks in the state. This is what the white supremacists feared and still do because they don't want to pay reparations to black people in America. Black Americans at that. So, continuing, this myth of California as a paradise doesn't allow us to hold ourselves accountable for the ways in which history has disenfranchised certain communities, he said. So, wanting to connect the past to the present, you can see that there's a larger trajectory of disenfranchisement that can't be ignored. As for the 3 black men who were ordered re-enslaved by a California justice of the peace, they were said to have escaped on their journey back to Mississippi, disappearing without a trace.
California never had slavery at all.
A California task force signed into law by Governor Gavin Newsom is recommending at least $250,000 for every black person who lives in California, a state which, by the way, was not even a slave state.
Cal was always Cal was always a free state, was it not?
That's correct.
I'm afraid you couldn't be more wrong.
Even after everything I just read to you, if you as an indigenous people who want to sit there and believe that California never had slaves, then you are surely just cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, only trying to maintain the status quo of white supremacy. Particularly if you are Mexican, Peruvian, Chilean, Chinese, and especially a black person who sit there and believe those lies about California being a quote unquote free state, you are a fool. Plain and simple. See, reparations for black Americans is a debt owed. It is not a handout. It is a debt owed. And if you want to talk about handouts, the Indians got handouts with free land, millions of dollars, and nobody said anything. The Japanese got reparations after the internment camps. Nobody said anything. Hell, Asian people in general has had a lot of set-asides in this country. If you want to talk about Chinatown being set up in black neighborhoods, but they never set up shop in the white ones because white people didn't want Asians, to make money off them. So they said, okay, let's put them in the black neighborhoods. Also, giving money away to Ukraine and all these other foreign nations don't seem to be a problem for most of you, now doesn't it? But yet, black people can't have access to reparation payments, those who are descendants of slaves. If you believe as such, then you are anti-black racist at that point. No matter what color skin you are an anti-black racist if you believe black folks, the descendants of slaves, can't get reparations. Plain and simple. But please leave your comments, like, comment, share, subscribe, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.